Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Science Dispatch podcast. My name is Cameron English. I am your host, as always, joined again by Dr. Barbara Billauer and
Hi.
Dr. Josh Bloom. This is a special occasion, Josh. You have deigned us with your presence. You've stepped down from your tower, and you're going to interact with us normal folk. How are you today?
Well, I had to take some time off from playing computer games, but this was sort of worth it.
Well, I'm honored. Barbara, it's great to see you again. How's life?
It's coming along. It's better than the alternative.
Yeah, I heard someone say recently they're breathing in vertical, so they can't complain. And I thought, that's a good way to look at it. Okay, well, in any case, we've got two stories to talk about today. We have both the authors with us, which is a special treat, not always the case. So this first one is by Dr. Bloom. It's called A Badly Needed Math Lesson for Senator Joe Manchin. Manchin, however you pronounce his name, not sure. But Josh, let me read this really brief introduction and then just summarize the story for us and tell us what we need to know. So you write, the BS that has been put out by the anti-opioid zealots has been more than bad enough. Then Senator Joe Manchin joined the fray, taking it to a new level. Disgusting. Okay. So now that we know where you stand in relation to this lovely senator of ours, Josh, what's going on here?
It's more of the same, except it's in the Senate, and I don't talk politics, but let's just say this guy doesn't have the greatest reputation for ethical behavior in the world, and leave it at that. So he's latching on to the oldest trick in the book in order to make opioid painkiller prescription drugs look bad. And the way you do that is you say, let's say in a press conference or a press release, 64 million people died from opioids last year. And then you go on to say whatever the hell, send me money or whatever that guy wants. Now, technically this is true, but it's also misleading to the point of being a lie. Because for those who are not really plugged into this, they're going to think, oh, well, this is this Purdue guys, and we're still prescribing all these pills and people are dying from them, which is a bunch of nonsense. Because if you look at that number, however many opioid deaths, something like 85, 90% of it is from illicit fentanyl and some of the other horrible things that are coming into the country. So by conflating those two, you're really lying. What he's doing is perpetuating this myth that drug companies and doctors and manufacturers and distributors are responsible for making these pills, and the death numbers from opioids go up and up every year. Well, that's true, but it's not because of the pills. The pills are a very minor contributor. So you have to ask yourself, what's to be gained by misdirecting people's thinking? And there's plenty to be gained. Money, power, the usual. There's an awful lot of money being made by, let's call it the anti-opioid industry. And this consists of the group PROP, Physicians for Responsible Opioid Prescribing, or a bunch of non-practicing academics who write negative things about opioids. Sometimes, occasionally, they're even correct, but not usually. And then they get themselves labels as experts. And Andrew Kolodny, who I won't be getting a Christmas gift from him anytime soon, unless it's anthrax. He's the president of Prop and probably hates me worse than anybody in the world because I call him out for all this nonsense and I make fun of him too. So he's made millions of dollars testifying for dirtbag trial lawyers. Apologies to any ethical trial lawyers that I may have caught in there.
That's me, John.
I know. That's why I mentioned it. I sometimes just open my mouth to change feet. This perhaps was one of those times. But I'm talking about the bad guys who are going after these companies like Johnson and Johnson, who had the unmitigated gall to manufacture essential medications. And if you can paint the portrait of manufacturers, distributors, pharmacies as the bad guys for keeping this death count rising every year, there's a lot of money to be made. Andrew Kolodny gets $725 an hour for his missed services. One trial alone, when Oklahoma was suing J&J, he collected $500,000, and this is by far not the only case he's been involved with. And there are a bunch of other ones in that same group that are doing the same thing. So, it's pretty obvious what is going on. We all have to make a living, and if it means making stuff up, he probably sleeps well at night.
Maybe read a novel instead of destroying people's well-being. Barbara, I'm really curious. I know, you have the legal background here, and I believe you're a little more plugged into the political discourse. So I'm wondering, what do you think's going on here with these politicians? Josh makes the point in the story that they've even opposed clinical trials for opioids that the FDA wanted to run. So there's obviously some thought behind what they're doing. So what do you think's going on?
And I also think Chuck also wrote about the opposition to the clinical trials.
He did. Mine was a follow-on to that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's very important to bring out to our readership, the objections. I mean, Kolodny's motivation, as Josh pointed out, is pretty clear. Then you have to ask about Manchin. And it's funny that you asked that question because I was saying the same thing. Why is he sticking his nose in this, especially since he comes from West Virginia, where his own constituency is beleaguered by it, by the problem. And as Josh has pointed out now and repeatedly, they are being hooked mostly by the fentanyl and fentanyl progeny. So why not go after that? And I'm saying, what is Joe Manchin doing? And the only thing I can figure out, because it's not money in his case, although he's getting something out of it, is that there's talk of a third party, and he seems to be kind of aligning himself in that direction. And maybe he fancies himself getting this new third party nomination, or if the third party wins, getting a cabinet spot in that third party. Or, RFK Jr. is running on an independent slot. Maybe he thinks RFK Jr. will nominate him as Secretary of Health and Human Services. I mean, politics makes strange bedfellows. So maybe by taking this aberrant, scientifically averse position, he's positioning himself with the anti-sciencers. But otherwise, it makes absolutely no logical sense why he would take that position. And the other interesting thing is the University of West Virginia Law School has a very, very good health law department, excellent. And their academics are sympathetic to Josser's position. They are not falling into the, oh my God, it's an opioid, let's kill anybody who has connection. One of the professors who was aligned with the school actually several years ago at a conference by the American Society of Law, Medicine, and Ethics got up and said exactly what Josh is saying. Interestingly enough, and this is really kind of surprising to me, is that this professor, who was also a nurse before she became a lawyer and a law professor, was saying that most of the deaths are from illicit drugs and not prescription drugs. And most of the attendees at this particular conference are either law professors, lawyers, or bioethicists. There happened to have been one physician in the room, and she attacked this law professor emotionally. And so there's some kind of, it was personal, it was an ad hominem attack. There's some kind of emotional reaction also, Josh, that I see in the people who are of the holier than thou, don't take pain medication school.
Before I get to that, let me suggest a couple of other motives. Obviously, West Virginia was hit harder than any other state by the pills. So do you think perhaps Manchin is eyeing a huge payday from Johnson & Johnson, Purdue, or what's left of them? And he can say, hey, I collected $600 million from these manufacturers. Or they go after Walgreens or CVS. And the other thing is, no politician ever lost a vote for being tough on opioids. But any politician that comes up with a platform saying that we have cut back our prescribing by too much is doomed. So money in politics, that's my take on it. As far as the thing with RFK Jr., which I guess I'll say this, he's referred to as RFK, which means really fucking, whoops, I mean, really F crazy. You better bleep with a K. You might want to bleep that part out.
We'll put like an alarm buzzer or something over it. So
that's good.
Just keep going.
If he and Manchin are running the country, I'm moving to the Russian border with any number of countries. Like, perhaps you could suggest one.
Well, that's interesting. I can actually. As you know, I've lived in Israel for many years, and I've never seen this analysis. There are other countries that are not as Neanderthal as we are about drugs, Israel being one of them. I had surgery last year, minor surgery, painful, but minor surgery. And they couldn't, how much do you want? I mean, I don't take the drugs, but I took it with me to squirrel it away. God forbid I needed it. There was no problem in dispensing the drugs. And so there are other countries that are much more relaxed, and we don't see the abuses that are forecasted to happen if we don't rein in these products. So it'd be interesting to compare the situation in other countries with what's happening here. The abuses don't happen.
Let's not forget that this officially started in 2016 when the mutants at CDC came out with a table of morphine milligram equivalents, which then became law in 40 states. Absolutely ignoring the science that tells anyone with a background that the table is meaningless and harmful. So the CDC, which knows nothing about drugs, stuck its nose in. Why? Because there were a bunch of prop members on the advisory board to come up with the CDC guidelines. Bang, 2016, you've got guidelines. They become law, and now everybody's getting tough on opioids, and that's really where this started. And they're not in Israel.
Maybe this is a question for both of you. Sorry to cut you off, Josh. I just keep thinking of stuff. So, Barbara, I want your take on this first. This morphine milligram equivalence standard. again, just a consumer as far as this question goes, but it seems to me that that's not really used in any other setting where you're trying to figure out the toxicity of something or the risks that something poses. So like, for example, when they put an artificial sweetener on the market, they don't use sugar milligram equivalents, right? They figure out at what dose does it have some kind of a biological effect, and then they set the threshold way lower than that. And then
that's the way they do it
ahead.
here. That's the way they do it here in the U.S. and Israel. They just stick a label on it, excess sugar. So there are no standards. They're just lots of sugar, lots of fat. Does it stop anybody from buying it? No, of course not.
Consider drugs, though. There are recommended doses for antibiotics, for NSAIDs, cholesterol medicines, antivirals. Name a single other drug or class of drugs where there are laws preventing you going over a theoretical and meaningless maximum.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at. That's what I'm getting at.
You have that. You have that in the environmental area. You have your EPA standards. You have that in the occupational area, TLDs, threshold limit values, permissible exposure limits. So you do have somewhat arbitrary values in, maybe not in the consumables, what you're eating, but certainly what you're exposed to. So maybe that's where it comes from. Josh, I want to ask a question. Why isn't there, or maybe there is, a rival group to PROP that sets up with the same or better qualifications and tries to infiltrate CDC or FDA or HSS?
The problem is there are lots of them. It's a splintered effort, and a lot of them are fighting with each other over who knows what, credit or ideas. So there is there's no uniform group that's single-minded and large enough. On the other hand, there are many smaller groups like us and others that are effective. And, we have gotten legislation changed in Minnesota, for example, and other people are putting together a lawsuit to sue the DEA for its absolute insane abuse of power. And let me just address the last thing you said before Cameron kicks me off. Of course, there's standards about toxic chemicals in water and in whatever. Well, there should be, because they may not be realistic, and the numbers are probably a function of better analytical instrumentation rather than anything else. These things were there all along, you just couldn't measure them. But what I find most disturbing is now that you've got government right in between the patient and the physician on this particular area of controlled substances. Why? That you don't have the government isn't talking about aspirin, or it's not setting limits on Lipitor. It's not throwing physicians in jail who prescribe too much amoxicillin. It's only this. And this is a function of the malfeasance of the CDC, PROP, and all the other people that are making money off this. Just my opinion, but that doesn't mean I'm wrong.
Well, I agree that just because it's your opinion doesn't mean you're wrong. But I do disagree that that's the motivation. You do have the federal government, unfortunately, stepping in with abortion and with trans care. You had them step in with allowing ivermectin to be prescribed in several hospitals. Some physicians who were not credentialed were seeking to prescribe ivermectin without ever seeing the patient, and they went to court, and the judges said, okay, so you do have, unfortunately, the law and politics intervening or sticking its nose in where it doesn't belong. Normally, though, the physician who prescribes too much antibiotics or whatever is reined in by those horrible bloody trial lawyers, because if there's an adverse response, you don't care if somebody takes too much of a drug and nothing happens, but if something does happen to a patient, then the horrible trial lawyer brings a lawsuit, and physicians are much more careful. On the other hand, sometimes they're over careful, but they're much more careful because they're afraid of these lawsuits, and worse than that, they're afraid of their skyrocketing malpractice premiums. So you don't need the government to step in. I'm not sure the government should step in any time, but you do have it in other cases.
That's protecting people from malpractice. This is...
Well, this is also malpractice.
Oh, no. If you're allowed to give 90 milligrams of morphine to an opioid rapid metabolizer who's been on 500 and they've been tapered down to 90, that's malpractice. But the government is forcing doctors to do this.
Well, that's what I'm saying. The government should not step in these cases the same way they shouldn't be allowed to step in with abortion. And unfortunately, they are.
Well, I'm specifically talking about medications. Ivermectin's kind of a one-off due to all the craziness that went on with that. But there's really there's a stigma attached to opioids because it's very easy to paint Vicodin users as drug addicts, when in fact, by a huge percentage, they're not, especially medically treated patients with pain. They almost never get addicted. So that's the big lie right there. And that sets up the pseudo caring for the American public and protecting them from these evil drugs. Meanwhile, since 2010, prescriptions have dropped 60%, and the rate of opioid overdoses has doubled, tripled, or whatever. And there's a clear inverse proportion between the two. So the more you restrict safer drugs, the more deaths you have. That's called the iron law of prohibition. It's something Jeff Singer and I have written about a whole bunch of times. And if you look at these graphs and the evidence surrounding them, it's not, this is not a correlation between prescriptions and deaths, inverse correlation. This is causation.
I think that the anti-opioid industry is playing into the portrayal of the dangers of opioids, the robberies, the thefts, the murders committed by the drug users, an image that has been perpetrated in the literature and media. And so it's easy to take advantage of these horrible, quote unquote, people who are taking drugs, because people cannot discern out the difference between a pain patient who needs the drug to function and somebody who's going to steal or rob to get money for their drugs, legal or not.
But I argue, and I firmly believe that Manchin, other politicians, they could care less how many people are dropping dead in the streets. This is money behind this. This is pure sleaze. You can construct an argument, which is long gone, by the way, about the damage that all these drug-addled people are doing in terms of robberies. Well, they're not anymore because they're dropping dead from fentanyl. So that story is obsolete and by quite
I'm
a
not
bit.
saying, yeah, I'm not saying that it's
Barbara, why don't you respond to that and then let's move on to your story because I know this
Okay.
could go on for a long time, but let's.
I'm not saying that it's accurate. I'm saying that a lot of people, especially the novel readers, are reading stories, many of them written in the 1800s, of the drug user and the ravaged drug user, and people are carrying on this mental view that's tapped into by the people who want to exploit them. I personally, I'm not sure that Manchin's motivated by money. I think it's more insidious in his case. I think it's politics and maybe more dangerous. I mean, somebody gets money for it, they put it in their pocket. Somebody wants to become president. That makes me a little bit more nervous. So, but there's clearly a motivation there. I just wish that the anti-opioid could get their act together, the medical group, and so that they would have the power. And it's distressing to me that there's that fragmentation, so they don't have the power.
But it's effective nonetheless. And let me just close with a response to the last thing you said, and then I'll shut up. It's there's a little bit of progress and I read everything in the press. The term opioid crisis has been replaced with fentanyl crisis. That is a big step forward.
I agree.
On the other hand, go ahead.
You get a lot of credit for that. My hat's off to you on that. You have labored long and hard and loud, and thankfully you've made a dent.
Your hat's all obviously off because you're not wearing one.
But nobody else knows that, or there's nobody who's supposed to know that.
Good point. I'm done. Great conversing with you, Barbara. You're just an incredible addition to this organization, and
Thank you.
I'm so glad to have you on board. Now, would you like me to stay on and give my
yes, I would. Yeah.
Yes. Me too.
Yeah. If anything, just for like a one-off body part joke, I think that would be helpful. But let's actually get the substance of the story out of the way first, because that's the part that people are listening for, hopefully. So this piece is called "Body Fluids for Sale: Our Body Parts Next." So Barbara, here's the brief introduction, and then I'll let you take it away. So you write, the EU is about to ban the sale of body fluids, including breast milk, sperm, blood, and other, quote, substances of human origin. SOHO, which is an interesting acronym there. Some argue this will decrease supply. Others claim regulation protects human dignity. Who's right and how do we decide? Excellent questions. Why don't you start with those, if you would, Dr. Villar?
Thank you. Well, there is proposed legislation that the European Union, who actually are more sensitive to bioethical issues, I would say, than Americans, is about to ban the sale of body fluids. On one hand, you have people who say that would be terrible because we need these fluids. On the other hand, you have people who are saying, well, that is protecting the integrity of the human body, the human dignity, because if we let body fluids, which are breast milk, sperm, eggs, plasma be sold, the next thing is body parts. And so you have people who come armed, not all that different from the opioid situation, with their own preconceived notions, advocating either side of the issue. And there we sit.
Okay. This is, and I'm just trying to frame my thoughts here. So this is obviously really, really controversial. But as you just said, I think people approach it and they say, well, I have a knee-jerk reaction. Maybe they don't say this to themselves, but it's subconscious, right? They have a knee-jerk reaction, has an ick factor, the idea of selling breast milk, for example, as a new dad and as someone who has another child on the way, I sort of get like why someone would go, that's creepy. And my understanding is there are some risks linked to buying random breast milk, So maybe you could tackle that, are people scared of this because they have a legitimate reason, or is it because they're just afraid, or is it some combination of the two, do you think?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that there's a knee-jerk, I think, was it Art Kaplan? One of the bioethicists called it the yuck factor. You don't know it but you know it's yucky when you hear about it. So it's
Right.
the yuck factor. There's a yuck factor. The other issue is if we ban the sale, there won't be enough. There'll be a problem with supply. And so several months ago in the US, there was a serious shortage of formula, and having available breast milk would have made, or having a surplus of breast milk would have made a dent in a horrible situation. I mean, Biden, I think, was commissioning planes to go to Europe and buy it. So there's an issue about having enough supply of something that we need, like breast milk. Do we need enough sperm and egg? And I wrote an article here not long ago about anonymity of gamete donation. And the people who want to keep gametes anonymous have the same issue. If we do anything to restrict donation by either making disclosure of names available, identity available, or restricting payment, we're going to restrict supply. Now, in the case of breast milk, you need it. In the case of sperm, depending on who you ask, if you have somebody who's infertile, they need it, in quotes. Do they need it to survive? Of course not, but they do need it as a function of their right to have children, which is a right. You do have a right to have children. So the question becomes, to what extent do these interventions actually impede supply? And in this group that I'm heading for, the International Chair in Bioethics, we had 8 different countries report on sale of sperm, and the outcome was so totally dependent on the cultural nuances of the country. So if a country who believes that this is something that we don't want to talk about, they're all for anonymity, and they claim that if you allow the sale of it, if you disallow the sale and if you require disclosure, you're going to impact availability. Well, in Australia, which just changed the law and made sale available, but yet requires disclosure of identity, once they did that, the availability of sperm increased. So basically, the outcome is going to be culturally determined. You can't say, well, if I put a ban on it, I'm not going to have it, or I'm not going to have it. The problem is, can we separate the two out? Is there a logical difference between body parts, selling a lobe of a lung or selling a kidney, and selling breast milk? Or if we allow breast milk as the next step down the road, a lobe of your lung.
Right. So is it a slippery slope, in other words? And of course, both of your takes would be helpful here. But Josh, I kind of get the sense that this is another example of silly prohibitionist thinking, and they're different markets, they're different products, right? A lung is not the same thing as a prescription opioid pill that you buy off the street that's laced with fentanyl or something like that. But it sounds to me like we have a situation where people are going to write down on a piece of paper that you can't sell blood or body parts. And then they're going to pretend that we solved the problem. And in reality, that's not going to solve it. I mean, to some extent, there's going to be an underground market. I know, like, for breast milk, for example, there was this weird fad going around for a while of weightlifters buying breast milk because they read on the internet that, it was going to really boost their gains and they were going to get super swollen biceps because of all of the nutrients in breast milk. And then, of course, you had physicians come out and say, well, that's idiotic, and here's why. So I guess what I'm asking is, if there's a demand for something, there's going to be some supply of it. So maybe, and again, this is the classic, harm reduction argument. It's like, maybe we make it available legally and we regulate it, and that way we have some control over the availability of whatever the product is, versus just saying we're gonna ban it. What do you think? Let's start, Josh, and then Barbara jump on in after that.
To me, this is actually a legitimate ethical question, because I suspect there are people with no money to be made one way or the other who feel strongly about these issues based on their upbringing, their religion, or whatever gets them tuned into this kind of thing. The opioid stuff is just, it's corruption playing upon fears of the public, which no longer exist. So, this is not as simple to dissect because, they're breast milk, blood, there are definitely benefits to having more of a supply. There are going to be people who take advantage of it in an unsavory way. Sperm, I don't know. I had those bad boys rewired years ago, so it just doesn't affect me at all.
In case anybody was wondering.
Right, just because I never like to divulge anything personal in these things. I can kind of see both sides of it. And then when you get to organs, it gets even more touchy. But, part of me thinks that if you need a kidney and some impoverished person wants to sell one, you could at least make an argument that it makes sense to do that, even though you're going further into the ethical vacuum than just blood or breast milk. So I don't have a strong opinion on this, but I guess I would lean towards not having prohibitions against anything unless, there was real harm that could be associated with it. I don't know what Barbara thinks about that, because she knows what she's talking about here. So there's the difference.
So the question is, can we distinguish or differentiate between body fluids and body parts? The facile discriminator would be one is replaceable and one isn't. Well, except for a kidney, you don't need both kidneys. You can give up a kidney, so it doesn't make a difference if it's replaceable or not. One's a spare anyway. You can give part of your liver. You apparently can give part of a lung. So what difference does it make if it's replaceable or you don't need it? The question is, at what point along the continuum do you say, no, you can't? Surely you can get along with one kidney, but isn't it always better to have a spare? On the other hand, if a father needs a new kidney and the son wants to donate it, we not only let them, but the father will certainly bless the child and maybe even give him more of an inheritance. I don't know about that, but then again, as Cameron was saying, where does the slippery slope end? And there's a horrifying story called Never Let Me Go about children bred for extra body parts. It's a horrible story. I mean, it's beautifully written, but it's a horrible story. And then you get the question, a lot of this stuff is not really far-fetched. We can, with 3D body parts, we can start making 3D body parts. With the new technology about rejuvenating embryonic stem cells, we can take embryonic stem cells, rejuvenate them, and then grow them up to be, what do you want? A heart, a lung, or something like that. And then we have the next issue as well. Maybe you don't need human body parts. We can use pig body parts. What about a pig heart? You want a pig heart?
Well, we do.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So if we can use pig hearts, and we do, shouldn't that be preferable to using human organs? Or maybe not.
Let me turn it around a little bit. No one has any trouble with a father or mother or sibling donating a kidney to a dying child.
Or vice versa.
The main fact is that by getting the donation, the person will live, and without it, the person will die. why is that different than a poor person in Mexico or Central America who desperately needs the money selling a kidney? The person still lives, and the person who sells it benefits from it, unlike the family member who only benefits by having their relative alive. Doesn't benefit financially, obviously. So I guess I don't understand why one is a whole lot different than the other.
I think there's a big difference between, let's say, breast milk and surrogacy on one hand, or a kidney and a liver lobe on the other.
I'm talking about organs now.
Okay. In some case, well, but even in body fluids, I mean, surrogacy can be very harmful and is very harmful to the surrogate. Same thing with egg donation. The women who give eggs have to be given hormones, and those hormones can be harmful. And so even in the easier case of body fluids, where the donation can be harmful or the exploitation can be harmful. And so let's say we have a woman who's normally breastfeeding. Certainly wet nurses have, which is the same thing as selling breast milk, have been accepted through the ages. We had women who are wet nurses. But what if somebody can take a drug, and there are drugs that are available to aid in proliferation of breast milk? Every drug, if you don't need it, the harms outweigh the benefit if you don't need it. And that's the same thing with organs, to the extent that even the surgery itself, even if you are giving a kidney, which you certainly don't need, but that surgery is potentially risky.
Yeah. And not pleasant either.
And so the only quote unquote excuse for government to step in would be to protect the vulnerable. And so somebody who is doing it just because they don't have money, then the government, that shows that the government is remiss in making sure that that person is so desperate that they're willing to sell a body part. Because if you allow sale of a kidney for someone who is desperate, let's assume that we now get to the point where we can attach another arm and somebody's really poor. So I'll sell my arm. I need the money. I'll sell my arm. Somebody else can use it. Well, why not? Why not? If you're a lefty and, if you want to sell your right arm, go right ahead. So there has to be some responsibility to protect people who are making decisions solely for money, especially now, then the question is, how poor is poor? To somebody who can't afford bread for their children, that's very poor. To somebody who just wants another Lamborghini, and so I'll sell my arm because I want a Lamborghini, I want the money. What difference does it make? The government can tell you, well, you're allowed to sell it for this, but not for that. And so you create a society that is making body parts fungible, or commoditizing. The word is commoditizing the human. Okay, what's the difference? I'll give up my arm, I'll give up my kidney. I don't need it, and I'll make some money out of it.
Okay, well, no one ever died from having one arm. And speaking from the viewpoint of the person that's dying, one could argue that what's most important is that person gets a kidney to live. And whether that comes from a relative or somebody who's in a poor country where they are not ever going to have whatever money it takes to survive, and we both know that. The dying person lives, and just like the relative has gets an advantage of keeping someone alive, the donor who's getting paid has their own advantage, and it's no more risky to take a kidney from a young, poor mother than it is from your father or your mother or your sister. So I guess we probably disagree a little bit on this. And if you're worried about an arm, there ought to be some way to restrict it to life-saving procedures, liver, lung, kidney, and not
If you look at
arms.
if you look at the question from a purely theoretical standpoint, what you're saying has some merit. The problem, let's say, with kidneys is before we start embarking down this road, we need to be mindful of the fact that there's a huge percentage of wasted kidneys that are donated. And so it's not like we're in a situation where we don't have the kidneys. We do have them. We're not utilizing them well. They're trying to reorient the system. Maybe we should be working on developing 3D kidneys or harvesting animal kidneys before we start with using human kidneys. And the fact that it's no more harmful for a poor person than a rich person does not negate the fact that it does have potential risks for anybody. And for a child to give an organ to his parents or vice versa, or her parents, the risk is outweighed or offset by the unpriceable longevity of a parent or a child. You cannot put money on that. That is priceless. While money for bread that somebody sells a kidney for, the government can give you a piece of bread. They should give you a piece of bread. And if you're in a situation where you're having people selling organs because they don't have basic necessities, that's a massive indictment on the society, on the government that doesn't provide basic necessities such that people are feeling compelled to sell their organs. And then, of course, you have the point where if that is allowed, you're allowing people to be subject to societal pressure. How could you not sell your organ to feed your children?
Well, you two are like you're like talking heads, but really thoughtful and helpful.
Ask the people in Venezuela how they feel about that.
Well, because that's a good question. I will ask my colleagues. I will do that.
I think what you guys are revealing is that this is so freaking complicated. There's so many seemingly valid points on both sides of the discussion, and I don't know. It almost sounds to me like you have to have a society that more or less has the same ethical framework for a question like this, because we clearly don't have that. I mean, between the three of us, it sounds like there are diverging opinions. So imagine between 300 million people, different backgrounds, different cultures, different religious beliefs. We're just not in a place where we can legislate this sensibly. I mean, I don't know, but it sounds like something we need to revisit. Which seems to be the running theme here, Barbara. Ever since you joined the show, we bring up these topics and we go, well, we'll get back to that because You know,
That's what makes it fun.
Right. Yeah. Growing embryos in the lab and all this crazy bioengineering stuff. Okay. Well, let's call it a day for now because I think we got a lot of good stuff on the record here. So we'll be back next week for another episode. In the meantime, follow us on social media. Dr. Josh Bloom is at Josh Bloom ACSH on Twitter or X. That's his focus group name that he did research into before putting up as his handle. The organization is just at ACSH.org on Twitter. And Barbara, people can just go to our website. Your archive is there. Your preprint archive is also there. So there's all kinds of great stuff you've done. So go check out all the work that our brilliant scholars have done. And until then, see you next week.